The fluorescent lights of the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in San Antonio, Texas, hummed with that particular frequency that seemed to exist only in hospitals. It was the kind of sound that became invisible after a few minutes, blending into the background noise of shuffling feet, distant monitors beeping, and the occasional announcement over the intercom system. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the faint aroma of institutional coffee drifting from the nurses' station created an atmosphere that was neither welcoming nor hostile, just clinical. Harold Mitchell sat in his wheelchair in the waiting area of the third-floor cardiology department, his weathered hands resting on the armrests. At 87 years old, his body had become a roadmap of the life he had lived. The deep lines on his face told stories of laughter and grief, of sun-soaked days on fishing boats and sleepless nights in foxholes. His silver hair, still surprisingly thick, was neatly combed back in the style he had maintained since his military days. He wore a faded blue baseball cap with the words "Korea Veteran 1950-1953" embroidered in gold thread, and a windbreaker that bore the patches of his former unit. Harold had arrived at the hospital at 7:30 that morning for what was supposed to be a routine cardiac checkup. His daughter, Margaret, had dropped him off at the entrance with strict instructions to call her as soon as he was finished. She had wanted to stay, but Harold had insisted she go to work. He didn't need babysitting, he had told her. He had survived 2 years in Korea. He could handle a doctor's appointment. That had been 4 hours ago. The waiting room was sparsely populated at this hour. A middle-aged man in a Vietnam veteran's cap sat 2 rows behind Harold, flipping through an outdated magazine without really reading it. Near the window, a young woman in her 30s sat with her elderly father, holding his hand and speaking to him in soft, reassuring tones. The television mounted in the corner played a morning news program, with the volume turned down low, the anchor's lips moving silently as images of traffic and weather flashed across the screen. Harold shifted in his wheelchair, trying to find a more comfortable position. His back ached from sitting for so long, and his legs, weakened by peripheral neuropathy from diabetes, tingled with that familiar pins and needles sensation. He reached into the pocket of his windbreaker and pulled out a small photograph, its edges worn soft from years of handling. The image showed a young soldier in uniform, barely 20 years old, standing next to a Korean farmer and his 2 children. The soldier's face was Harold's, frozen in time, capturing a moment of genuine happiness amidst the chaos of war. "Mr. Mitchell!" A voice cut through his reverie. Harold looked up to see a young nurse approaching him. She couldn't have been more than 25, with blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail and eyes that seemed to look through him rather than at him. Her name tag identified her as Patricia Chambers, RN. She walked with the brisk efficiency of someone who had too much to do and not enough time to do it. "Yes, that's me," Harold replied, his voice carrying the slight rasp that came with age, but still holding the firm timbre of a man who had once commanded soldiers. Patricia glanced at the clipboard in her hand, her lips pressing together in a thin line. "You've been waiting for quite a while, I see." 4 hours and 12 minutes, Harold said, offering a small smile. "But who's counting?" Patricia didn't return the smile. Instead, she looked at him with an expression that bordered on irritation. "Well, Mr. Mitchell, we're very busy today. Dr. Hernandez is running behind schedule. You'll just have to wait a little longer." Harold nodded, accustomed to the hurry-up-and-wait nature of VA hospitals. "That's all right. I understand. These things happen. Do you need anything while you wait? Water? A blanket?" Patricia's tone suggested she was asking out of obligation rather than genuine concern. "Actually," Harold said, shifting again in his wheelchair, "I could use some help getting to the restroom. My legs aren't what they used to be, and this wheelchair doesn't exactly navigate these halls on its own." Patricia let out a barely audible sigh, glancing at her watch. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm the only nurse on the floor right now. We're short-staffed, and I have medication rounds to complete. Can't you just hold it?" Harold's smile faltered slightly. "Ma'am, I'm 87 years old. Holding it isn't exactly an option anymore. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't necessary." "Look," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a lower register as she leaned closer. "I don't have time to wheel every old man to the bathroom. You're going to have to figure something out. Maybe try walking. Use the walls for support." The words hung in the air like a slap. Harold felt his cheeks flush, not from embarrassment, but from a deep, simmering indignation that he hadn't felt in years. He had survived the brutal Korean winter of 1950, had watched friends die in his arms, had carried wounded soldiers on his back through enemy fire. And now, in the twilight of his life, he was being told to figure something out by a nurse who couldn't be bothered to help him. "Ma'am," Harold said, his voice steady despite the emotion building in his chest, "I served this country for 22 years. I fought in Korea, spent 2 tours in Vietnam as an advisor, and served at the Pentagon until my retirement. I've never asked for special treatment, and I'm not asking for it now. All I'm asking for is a little dignity." Patricia rolled her eyes, an action she didn't even try to hide. "Oh, here we go, the I served my country speech. Look, Mr. Mitchell, I hear that every single day from guys like you. You're not special. You're just another patient in a long line of patients, and I don't have time for guilt trips. If you want to complain, there's a suggestion box at the front desk." The waiting room had gone quiet. The man in the Vietnam cap had stopped pretending to read his magazine and was watching the exchange with growing concern. The young woman by the window had turned her attention from her father to the scene unfolding before her. Harold's hand trembled slightly as he gripped the armrest of his wheelchair. He had faced down enemy soldiers, had stared death in the face more times than he could count. But this casual cruelty from someone who was supposed to help him, this felt like a wound he hadn't prepared for. "I'm sorry if I'm inconveniencing you," Harold said, his voice quieter now. "I just need some help." Patricia straightened up, smoothing the front of her scrubs. "And I just told you I can't help you right now. You're not my only patient. In fact, you're not even my patient. You're waiting for Dr. Hernandez, and until he calls for you, you're just sitting in my waiting room taking up space. So sit tight, don't cause any trouble, and someone will get to you eventually." She turned on her heel and began walking back toward the nurse's station, leaving Harold alone in the middle of the waiting room, his dignity stripped away like medals from a dishonored soldier. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second stretching into an eternity. Harold sat in his wheelchair, staring at the photograph in his hand, remembering a time when his country had called him a hero. Now he was just an old man taking up space. The automatic doors at the entrance to the cardiology wing slid open with a soft hiss, admitting a gust of warm Texas air and a man who seemed to fill the doorway with his presence. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the broad shoulders and lean build of someone who had spent a lifetime in peak physical condition. His hair, a mix of grey and dark brown, was cut short in a style that spoke of military precision. He wore a simple navy blue polo shirt tucked into khaki pants, and his movements had the fluid efficiency of a man trained to be aware of his surroundings at all times. Marcus Thompson was 48 years old, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen and done things that most people could only imagine. 22 years in the United States Navy, 18 of those as a Navy SEAL, had left their mark on him in ways both visible and invisible. The small scar above his left eyebrow was a souvenir from an operation in Afghanistan that remained classified to this day. The slight limp in his right leg, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it, was a reminder of a training accident that had ended his active duty career 3 years ago. Marcus had come to the VA hospital for his own appointment. a routine checkup for the chronic back pain that plagued him after years of carrying heavy equipment through hostile terrain. He had expected a quiet morning, a quick examination, and then maybe a stop at the barbecue place on Commerce Street that his buddy had been telling him about. What he hadn't expected was to walk into a scene that made his blood run cold. As he entered the waiting area, Marcus immediately noticed the old man in the wheelchair. There was something about the way he was sitting, hunched slightly forward, his hands gripping the armrests, that spoke of distress. But it was the cap on his head that caught Marcus's attention first. Korea veteran, 1950-1953. A war that had started 75 years ago, fought by men who were now in their late 80s and 90s. Men who had held the line against overwhelming odds, who had survived the Chosin Reservoir and the Pusan perimeter. Men who deserved to be treated with respect. Marcus slowed his pace, his trained eyes taking in the details of the scene. The old man's face was pale, and there was a tremor in his hands that spoke of either physical weakness or emotional upset. The other people in the waiting room were watching him with expressions ranging from sympathy to discomfort, the way people do when they've witnessed something unpleasant but don't want to get involved. And then Marcus saw the nurse. She was standing at the nurse's station, typing something into a computer with quick, efficient keystrokes. Her body language was dismissive, her back half turned to the waiting room, as if she couldn't be bothered to acknowledge the patients she was supposed to serve. Marcus's instincts, honed by years of reading situations and people, told him that something was wrong. He walked over to the old man in the wheelchair and crouched down beside him, bringing himself to eye level. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said, his voice low and respectful. "Are you all right?" Harold looked up, startled by the sudden presence. His eyes, still sharp despite his age, met Marcus's gaze and held it. There was a moment of recognition, not of identity, but of kinship. One soldier to another, across generations. "I've been better, son," Harold admitted, "but I'll be fine." Marcus nodded slowly, not pushing, but not backing away either. "I noticed you look a little upset. Is there something I can help with?" Harold hesitated, his pride warring with his need. He had never been one to complain, to air his grievances in public. But there was something about this younger man, something in the way he carried himself that spoke of integrity. "It's nothing," Harold said finally, "just a misunderstanding with the staff." The man in the Vietnam cap, who had been watching the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "It wasn't nothing," he said, his voice carrying across the waiting room. "That nurse over there just humiliated this man. Told him she didn't have time to help him to the bathroom, said he was just taking up space. I've never seen anything like it." Marcus's jaw tightened. He turned his head slowly toward the nurse's station, where Patricia Chambers was still typing, oblivious to the conversation happening behind her. "Is that true, sir?" Marcus asked Harold. Harold sighed, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I asked for help getting to the restroom. My legs don't work so well anymore, and I can't push this wheelchair on my own. She said she was too busy, told me to figure it out myself. Then she said I wasn't special, that I was just another patient taking up space." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had served with men who had been wounded in combat, had held friends as they took their last breaths, had carried the weight of lives lost on his shoulders every single day. And he had done it all so that men like Harold Mitchell could live out their remaining years with the dignity and respect they had earned. To hear that a nurse, someone who had taken an oath to care for others, had treated a Korean War veteran like an inconvenience was more than Marcus could stomach. He stood up slowly, his full height seeming to add to the tension in the room. "I'll be right back, sir," he said to Harold. "I'm going to have a word with that nurse." Harold reached out and caught Marcus's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Son, don't make a scene. I don't want any trouble." Marcus looked down at the old man's hand on his arm, then back up at his face. "Sir, with all due respect, you served this country when it needed you most. You fought in a war that most people today don't even remember. The least you deserve is basic human decency. And if that means making a scene, then that's what I'll do." He gently patted Harold's hand and walked toward the nurse's station, his footsteps measured and deliberate. Every eye in the waiting room followed him. Patricia Chambers heard the approaching footsteps and turned, her expression already set in the practiced look of professional detachment she used to deal with difficult patients. But as she took in the man standing before her, something in her demeanor shifted. There was an intensity in his eyes that she hadn't seen before, a controlled energy that seemed barely contained beneath the surface. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying the same dismissive tone she had used with Harold. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her name tag, committing the name to memory. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried an edge that made her take an involuntary step back. "Patricia Chambers," he said. "I just had a very interesting conversation with Mr. Harold Mitchell, the gentleman in the wheelchair over there, the one who served in Korea." Patricia's expression flickered, a brief moment of uncertainty crossing her features. "What about him?" "He tells me you refused to help him to the restroom. He tells me you said he was just taking up space. Is that accurate?" "Look," Patricia said, her defensiveness rising, "I don't know who you are, but I don't have to explain myself to you. I'm the only nurse on this floor, and I have a lot of patients to deal with. I can't drop everything every time some old guy needs to go to the bathroom." Marcus felt his hands clench into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice level. "That old guy, as you call him, is a decorated veteran who spent 2 years fighting in one of the most brutal wars in American history. He survived temperatures that would kill most people, fought in conditions you can't even imagine, and watched friends die so that people like you could have the freedom to treat him like garbage." Patricia's face flushed red, whether from anger or embarrassment, Marcus couldn't tell. "I don't need a history lesson. I have a job to do." "Your job," Marcus said, leaning slightly forward, "is to care for veterans. That's what this hospital is for. These men and women gave years of their lives. Some gave everything for this country. The least you can do is help them to the bathroom without making them feel like they're a burden." "You don't understand," Patricia shot back. "You don't work here. You don't know what it's like to deal with these people day after day. They're demanding. They're needy. They think they deserve special treatment just because they wore a uniform. Well, guess what? I wore scrubs. I worked 12-hour shifts. I deal with more problems in one day than you probably deal with in a year." The words hung in the air, and Marcus felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about Harold Mitchell anymore. This was about every veteran who had been dismissed, ignored, or mistreated by people who didn't understand the sacrifices they had made. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I spent 22 years in the Navy, 18 of those years as a SEAL. I've been shot at, blown up, and left for dead in places you've never heard of. I've held men in my arms as they died, written letters to their families, and carried the weight of their loss every single day. So don't you dare stand there and tell me that your 12-hour shifts compare to what these men have been through." Patricia's face had gone pale. The arrogance that had marked her earlier demeanor had evaporated, replaced by a growing awareness that she had made a serious mistake. "I didn't know," she stammered. "I didn't mean—" "You didn't know what? That treating a veteran like a human being might be part of your job. That basic decency isn't optional." Marcus shook his head slowly. "Let me tell you something, Patricia Chambers. That man over there, Mr. Mitchell, he's somebody's father, somebody's grandfather. He's lived a life of service that you couldn't begin to comprehend, and you made him feel worthless. You made him feel like he didn't matter. That's not just unprofessional, that's cruel. The commotion had attracted attention. A security guard standing near the elevators had begun walking over, his hand resting casually on his radio. From a hallway to the right, a man in a white coat emerged, alerted by the raised voices. His name tag identified him as Dr. Robert Hernandez, and he took in the scene with a mixture of concern and confusion. "What's going on here?" Dr. Hernandez asked, stepping between Marcus and the nurse's station. "Doctor," Marcus said, "I witnessed this nurse treating a patient with complete disrespect. She refused to help him to the restroom, told him he was taking up space, and dismissed his service to this country as if it meant nothing." Dr. Hernandez turned to Patricia, his expression hardening. "Is this true?" Patricia opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the man in the Vietnam cap stood up from his seat. "I saw the whole thing, Doctor. She treated that man like dirt. It was disgraceful." The young woman near the window nodded in agreement. "I heard it too. She was incredibly rude." Dr. Hernandez took a deep breath, his professional demeanor barely containing his anger. "Patricia, go to the break room. Now, we'll discuss this later." "Doctor, I can explain." "Now, Patricia." The nurse's shoulders slumped, and she walked away from the nurse's station, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence of the waiting room. "Doctor." Hernandez turned to Marcus, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Hernandez. I apologize for what you witnessed. It's not representative of how we treat our veterans here." Marcus shook the doctor's hand. "I appreciate that, sir. But I'm not the one who needs an apology." Dr. Hernandez nodded, understanding. He walked over to where Harold Mitchell sat in his wheelchair, still clutching the photograph of his younger self. The doctor crouched down, much as Marcus had done earlier, and looked the old man in the eyes. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm Dr. Hernandez. I am deeply sorry for how you were treated today. It was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for the staff under my supervision. I assure you, this will be addressed." Harold looked at the doctor, then at Marcus, then back at the doctor. The trembling in his hands had stopped, replaced by something else, something that looked like hope. "Thank you, Doctor," Harold said quietly. "I just wanted to be treated like a person." "You deserve far more than that," Dr. Hernandez replied. "Now, let me help you to the restroom, and then we'll get you into an examination room right away." As the doctor began to wheel Harold toward the restroom, the old man reached out and grasped Marcus's hand. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for standing up for me." Marcus squeezed his hand gently. "Sir, men like you are the reason I joined the military in the first place. Standing up for you is the least I could do." The waiting room had transformed. The tension that had hung in the air like a storm cloud had dissipated, replaced by something warmer. The man in the Vietnam cap gave Marcus a nod of respect. The young woman near the window wiped a tear from her eye. Even the security guard, who had been prepared for trouble, seemed moved by what he had witnessed. And in the middle of it all, Marcus Thompson stood alone, watching as Dr. Hernandez wheeled Harold Mitchell down the corridor. The old man's cap, Korea veteran 1950-1953, seemed to shine a little brighter under the fluorescent lights. Marcus didn't know it yet, but this moment would change his life forever. What had started as a simple doctor's appointment would become the beginning of a journey, one that would connect him to Harold Mitchell, to the nurse who had wronged him, and to the deeper truths about service, sacrifice, and redemption that lay at the heart of the American experience. But all of that was still to come. For now, Marcus simply stood in the waiting room of the VA hospital, watching a Korean War veteran finally receive the dignity he deserved. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the atrium of the VA Medical Center as Marcus Thompson made his way back to the cardiology wing. His own appointment had taken less than an hour, the doctor pronouncing his back pain manageable with continued physical therapy and an updated prescription for anti-inflammatories. But even as he received the news, his mind had been elsewhere, replaying the scene from that morning over and over again. He had intended to simply leave the hospital after his appointment, maybe grab that barbecue he had been thinking about, try to put the incident behind him. But something kept pulling him back. The image of Harold Mitchell, sitting alone in his wheelchair, clutching that photograph like a lifeline, the look of defeated dignity in his eyes, the way his voice had cracked when he said, "I just wanted to be treated like a person." Marcus had seen a lot in his years as a SEAL. He had witnessed acts of incredible bravery and unspeakable horror. He had learned to compartmentalize, to push emotions aside in order to complete the mission. But this was different. This wasn't a combat zone or a hostage rescue. This was a hospital in his own country, where a man who had served with honor was being treated with contempt. He couldn't just walk away. The cardiology wing was quieter now than it had been that morning. The waiting room held only a few patients, none of whom Marcus recognized from earlier. He approached the nurses' station, which was now staffed by a different nurse. An older woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her name tag read, Eleanor Washington, RN. "Excuse me," Marcus said. "I was here earlier today and met a patient named Harold Mitchell, Korean War veteran. I was wondering if you could tell me if he's still here." Eleanor looked up from her paperwork, studying Marcus with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades assessing people's intentions. Whatever she saw in his face seemed to satisfy her. "Mr. Mitchell finished his appointment about an hour ago," she said. "His daughter picked him up. Is there something I can help you with?" Marcus hesitated. "I just wanted to make sure he was okay. He had a rough morning." Eleanor's expression softened. "I heard about what happened. Word travels fast around here. What that nurse did was inexcusable. She's been suspended pending a formal review." "Good," Marcus said, though the word felt hollow. Punishment for the nurse didn't undo the harm that had been done. "Do you happen to have Mr. Mitchell's contact information? I'd like to check on him, maybe apologize on behalf of, well, everyone, I guess." Eleanor shook her head. "I can't give out patient information, privacy regulations, but—" She paused, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. "Mr. Mitchell is a regular here, comes in every month for his cardiac checkups. If you were to come back next month, same time, you might just run into him." Marcus nodded, understanding. "Thank you, ma'am." He turned to leave, but Eleanor's voice stopped him. "Sir? What you did this morning, standing up for him like that, it meant a lot. Not just to Mr. Mitchell, but to all of us who work here." Most people would have looked the other way. Marcus looked back at her. "I couldn't do that, ma'am, not for a man who did what he did." "You're a veteran yourself, aren't you?" Eleanor asked, though it was more statement than question. 22 years Navy, retired now." Eleanor smiled, a warm expression that seemed to light up her whole face. "Then you understand. Once a soldier, always a soldier. That bond doesn't break, no matter how many years pass." Marcus nodded again and walked out of the cardiology wing, his mind still churning with thoughts he couldn't quite articulate. Eleanor was right. The bond between those who had served didn't break. It was forged in shared sacrifice, in the knowledge that you had put your life on the line for something greater than yourself. Harold Mitchell had done that 75 years ago in a frozen hell on the other side of the world. Marcus had done it in deserts and jungles and mountains across the globe, different wars, different eras, but the same fundamental truth. They were brothers, and brothers looked out for each other. The sun was beginning to set by the time Marcus reached his truck in the hospital parking lot. The sky had turned a brilliant orange and pink, the kind of sunset that made you stop and appreciate the simple beauty of the world. He climbed into the cab and sat for a moment, keys in his hand, not yet ready to start the engine. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a text from his wife, Sarah. "How did it go? Want me to start dinner?" Marcus typed a quick reply. "Appointment was fine. Had an interesting morning. Tell you about it when I get home. Go ahead and start dinner. Love you." He put the phone away and finally started the truck, pulling out of the parking lot and onto the main road. The drive home took about 30 minutes, through streets lined with live oaks draped in Spanish moss, past neighborhoods where American flags flew proudly from front porches, and eventually into the quiet suburb where he and Sarah had lived for the past 3 years. Their house was a modest ranch-style home, single-story with a neatly trimmed lawn, and a workshop in the backyard where Marcus spent most of his free time building furniture. After years of living out of duffel bags and deploying to places where he couldn't tell his family where he was, the stability of a permanent home felt like a luxury he had never expected to have. Sarah met him at the door, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, an apron tied around her waist. She was 3 years younger than Marcus, with the kind of natural beauty that had caught his attention the moment they met at a Navy ball 15 years ago. They had been married for 12 years now, and she was still the best thing that had ever happened to him. "Hey, stranger," she said, kissing him on the cheek. "You look like you've got something on your mind." Marcus followed her into the kitchen, where the smell of grilled chicken and roasted vegetables filled the air. "I do," he admitted. "Something happened at the hospital today." As they sat down to dinner, Marcus told her everything. The old man in the wheelchair, the nurse's cruelty, the confrontation, the doctor's apology, and the lingering feeling that he should have done more, that somehow this wasn't finished. Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern to something that looked like pride. When Marcus finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. "You did the right thing," she said. "You stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for himself. That's who you are, Marcus. It's who you've always been." "I know," Marcus said, "but I can't stop thinking about him. 87 years old, Sarah. He fought in Korea when he was barely out of high school. He survived things I can't even imagine, and some nurse made him feel like he was nothing. That's not right." "No, it's not," Sarah agreed. "But you can't save everyone, Marcus. You know that." "I know. But maybe I can help this one." Sarah studied him for a long moment, the way she did when she was trying to read his intentions. "What are you thinking?" Marcus wasn't entirely sure himself. The idea was still forming, still taking shape in his mind. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't going to let Harold Mitchell fade back into anonymity. The man deserved more than a one-time intervention. He deserved recognition. He deserved to be remembered. "I'm not sure yet," Marcus admitted, "but I think I need to find him. Talk to him. Hear his story." Sarah smiled, the same smile that had made him fall in love with her all those years ago. "Then that's what you should do. You've always followed your instincts, Marcus. They haven't led you wrong yet." That night, after dinner was finished and the dishes were washed, Marcus sat in his workshop, surrounded by half-finished projects and the smell of sawdust. His laptop was open on the workbench, and he was searching for any information he could find about Harold Mitchell. It didn't take long. A quick search of public records revealed that Harold lived in a small house about 20 minutes from the VA hospital, in an older neighborhood that had once been predominantly military families. He had been a master sergeant in the army, retired after 22 years of service, with a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and a Korean Service Medal among his decorations. His wife, Eleanor, had passed away 6 years ago. He had one daughter, Margaret, who lived nearby. The more Marcus read, the more his respect for Harold grew. This wasn't just a veteran, this was a hero, a man who had given the best years of his life to his country and had asked for nothing in return. and he had been treated like an inconvenience by someone who couldn't be bothered to help him. Marcus closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of his workshop, listening to the chirp of crickets outside the window. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would find Harold Mitchell and do what he should have done that morning. He would give the man his respect. The morning sun was just beginning to burn off the Texas fog when Marcus pulled his truck onto Harold Mitchell's street. The neighborhood was exactly what he had expected. Modest, single-family homes built in the 50s and 60s, with mature trees shading the sidewalks and American flags flying from several porches. It was the kind of neighborhood where people still waved to their neighbors, where kids used to play in the streets before technology pulled them indoors. Harold's house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, a small brick ranch with a neatly trimmed lawn and a mailbox shaped like a miniature barn. The paint on the trim was slightly faded, and the bushes along the front could have used a trim, but overall, the place had the well-maintained appearance of a home that was loved. Marcus parked on the street and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He hadn't called ahead, which now seemed like either a stroke of genius or a terrible idea. What was he going to say? "Hi, I'm the guy from the hospital who yelled at your nurse. Can we talk?" But he had come this far. He wasn't about to turn back now. He walked up the driveway and rang the doorbell. For a long moment, there was no response. Then he heard the slow shuffle of footsteps approaching, and the door opened to reveal Harold Mitchell in a bathrobe and slippers, his silver hair slightly disheveled from sleep. Recognition dawned in Harold's eyes. "You're the young man from the hospital," he said. "The Navy SEAL." Marcus nodded. "Yes, sir. My name is Marcus Thompson. I hope I'm not intruding." Harold studied him for a moment, then broke into a smile that transformed his weathered face. "Intruding? Son, after what you did for me yesterday, you could intrude any time you like. Come in, come in." He stepped aside and gestured for Marcus to enter. The interior of the house was small but immaculately kept, with hardwood floors that had been polished to a shine and furniture that looked like it had been in the same spots for decades. Family photographs lined the walls, showing Harold and his late wife at various stages of their lives, their daughter's wedding, grandchildren growing up over the years. Harold led Marcus into a cozy living room, where a recliner faced a small television and a bookshelf overflowed with worn paperbacks and military history volumes. "Have a seat," Harold said, gesturing to a sofa. "Can I get you some coffee? My daughter makes it for me before she leaves for work. It's not the best, but it's hot." "Coffee would be great, sir, thank you." Harold shuffled into the kitchen, and Marcus heard the clinking of cups and the sound of coffee being poured. A few minutes later, the old man returned with 2 mugs, handing one to Marcus before settling into his recliner with a sigh of relief. "My daughter's been fussing over me since yesterday," Harold said, shaking his head. "She wanted to file a complaint with the hospital, contact the news, raise all kinds of hell. I told her to let it go." "What's done is done. I understand, sir, but what happened to you wasn't right, you know that." Harold took a sip of his coffee, his eyes growing distant. "I've seen a lot of things that weren't right in my life, son. That's the way of the world. You learn to roll with the punches." Marcus leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Can I ask you something, sir?" "Ask away." "What was it like? Korea, I mean. I've read about it, studied it in training. But I've never met someone who was actually there." Harold's expression shifted, the present moment fading as memories from 75 years ago rose to the surface. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at a spot on the wall that seemed to hold secrets only he could see. "Cold," he said finally. "That's what I remember most, the cold. They called it the coldest winter in 100 years. We didn't have the gear for it. Half my unit got frostbite. Some of them lost fingers, toes, worse. We'd dig foxholes, and the ground would be so frozen we'd barely make a dent, and then the Chinese came, He paused, taking another sip of coffee. November 1950. The Chinese crossed the Yalu River and hit us like a tidal wave. 100,000 of them, maybe more. We were outnumbered 10-1, and our supply lines had been cut. The brass told us to retreat, but retreat wasn't easy when the enemy was on all sides. Marcus listened in silence, respecting the gravity of the memories being shared. I was 19 years old, Harold continued. A private first class, scared out of my mind. My sergeant, a guy named O'Brien from Boston, he kept us together. He was 32, which seemed ancient to us kids. He'd been in World War II, fought in Europe, knew what combat was like. He told us the only way to survive was to stick together, to watch each other's backs no matter what. Did you survive, I mean? Harold nodded slowly. Most of us did. Not all. We lost O'Brien at Chosin. He took a bullet meant for me, pushed me out of the way and caught it in the chest, died in my arms, there in the snow. He was the first man I ever watched die. He wasn't the last. The room felt heavy with the weight of those memories. Marcus understood that weight. He had carried his own version of it for years, the faces of fallen brothers that haunted his dreams, the names he still recited in moments of quiet. "I'm sorry, sir," Marcus said. "I know what that's like, not Korea, but I've lost people too." Harold looked at him with eyes that suddenly seemed sharper, more focused. "I know you have, son. I can see it in you. That look, it's in both of us. It never goes away, does it?" "No, sir, it doesn't." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, two warriors from different eras connected by an understanding that transcended time and circumstance. Finally, Harold spoke again. "Why did you come here, Marcus? And please call me Harold. Sir makes me feel like I should be giving orders." Marcus smiled slightly. "All right, Harold. I came because, honestly, I'm not entirely sure. I couldn't stop thinking about what happened at the hospital. It bothered me more than I expected, and I realized that I didn't want that to be the end of the story. I wanted to know you, to hear about your life, to understand the man behind the cap." Harold chuckled, a warm sound that lightened the mood. "The man behind the cap. I like that. Well, Marcus, my life isn't anything special. I grew up in Oklahoma, enlisted when I was 18 because there wasn't much else to do in my town. Served in Korea, came home, married my sweetheart Eleanor, had a daughter, worked as an electrician for 40 years, retired, and now I spend my days watching too much television and waiting for doctor's appointments." "With all due respect, Harold, that's a lot more special than you give yourself credit for. Not many people can say they survived what you survived. Not many people served their country the way you did." Harold waved his hand dismissively. "I just did what millions of other boys did. We answered the call. Some of us came home, some didn't. The ones who didn't, they're the real heroes." Marcus recognized the sentiment. He had felt the same way about his own fallen brothers. But he also knew that survivor's guilt could distort the truth, could make a man feel like his sacrifice was somehow less meaningful because he had lived. "Harold," Marcus said carefully, "I came here to tell you something. What happened at the hospital? The way that nurse treated you, it wasn't just about her being unprofessional. It was about something bigger. There's a whole generation of veterans, your generation, who are fading away. The Korean War is called the Forgotten War for a reason. People don't talk about it, don't learn about it, don't remember the men who fought it, and when someone like that nurse dismisses you, dismisses your service, it's like she's forgetting all over again." Harold's eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "It's true," he said quietly. "Korea, it's like it never happened. Vietnam gets attention, World War II gets parades, but Korea? People look at me like I'm talking about ancient history. My own grandchildren barely know where Korea is." "That's what I want to change," Marcus said, the idea that had been forming in his mind finally crystallizing into words. "I want to help people remember. I want to tell your story, Harold. Share it with others, not just for you, but for everyone who served with you, everyone who never came home. Harold was silent for a long moment, processing the unexpected turn the conversation had taken. Finally, he spoke. And how would you do that? Marcus didn't have all the answers yet. He wasn't a writer or a filmmaker or a historian, but he knew how to plan a mission, how to set objectives and work toward them step by step. And this, he realized, had become his mission. I'm not sure of all the details yet, Marcus admitted, but I know people who might be able to help. There are organizations that document veteran stories, record oral histories, make sure they're preserved for future generations. I could reach out to them, see what's possible. And in the meantime, I'd like to come back if you'll let me. Sit with you, listen to you, learn from you. Harold studied Marcus with an expression that mixed surprise with something that looked like gratitude. You know, Marcus, most people my age, we're invisible. We're just old folks waiting to die, forgotten by a world that moved on without us. But you're looking at me like I matter, like my life means something. It does matter, Harold. It means more than you know. The two men sat in the quiet living room, the morning sun streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. Outside, a car drove by, a dog barked in the distance, the mundane sounds of everyday life continuing around them. But inside that small house, something had changed. A connection had been forged, one that would grow stronger in the days and weeks to come. Harold Mitchell had found an unexpected ally, and Marcus Thompson had found a purpose he hadn't known he was searching for. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus's first visit to Harold's house, and in that time the two men had developed a routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, Marcus would arrive at 9 o'clock with a box of donuts from the bakery on Main Street, and he and Harold would sit in the living room drinking coffee and talking for hours. Harold had initially been reluctant to share the deeper details of his life, the memories he had kept locked away for decades. But Marcus's patient, respectful approach had gradually broken down those barriers. He didn't push, didn't probe, simply listened with the focused attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. And Harold, finding in Marcus a kindred spirit who could comprehend the weight of his experiences, began to open up in ways he never had before. He talked about growing up during the Great Depression, about the poverty that had shaped his family, and the small Oklahoma town where everyone knew everyone else's business. He talked about his father, a World War I veteran who never spoke about what he had seen in the trenches of France, whose silence had planted a seed of stoicism that Harold carried his entire life. He talked about Eleanor, his wife of 61 years, how they had met at a church social when he was home on leave, how she had written him letters every single day during his time overseas, how her words had been a lifeline in the darkest moments of combat. He talked about her death 3 years ago, and how the house still felt empty without her, how he sometimes forgot she was gone and started to call out to her before catching himself. And he talked about Korea. The things he had seen, the things he had done, the friends he had lost. He talked about the night patrols, the constant fear, the way death could come at any moment from a sniper's bullet or a mortar round, or the frozen ground that could claim a man as surely as any weapon. He talked about the prisoners they had taken, the humanity he had tried to maintain even in the face of an enemy who showed none. He talked about the day he came home, stepping off a bus in his hometown to find that life had moved on without him, that no one understood what he had been through, that the war he had fought was already being forgotten. Marcus recorded everything. He had set up a small digital recorder with Harold's permission and captured hours of audio that he would later have transcribed. He took notes, asked clarifying questions, and gradually assembled a comprehensive picture of one man's journey through war and peace, through love and loss, through a life that spanned nearly 9 decades of American history. On this particular Thursday, Harold was talking about a day in March 1951, when his unit had been assigned to defend a hill that the brass had deemed strategically important. They called it Hill 355, though the men who fought there had other names for it, names that couldn't be repeated in polite company. "We'd been up there for 3 days, Harold said, his voice taking on the distant quality it always had when he delved into memories from the war. "No resupply, no reinforcement. The Chinese hit us every night, wave after wave. They'd blow bugles and beat drums trying to scare us. The first time we heard it, it worked. But by the 3rd night, we were too tired to be scared anymore." Marcus leaned forward, captivated. "How many men did you have?" "Started with 42. By the time relief came, we were down to 19. Harold paused, taking a sip of coffee that had long gone cold. 23 boys, all younger than you are now, all gone in 3 days. And for what? We held that hill. But a month later, the brass decided it wasn't important anymore, and we pulled back. All those lives for a piece of ground that nobody wanted." The bitterness in Harold's voice was palpable, a wound that 75 years had never fully healed. Marcus understood that bitterness. He had felt it himself, had questioned the decisions of commanders who sat in air-conditioned offices while men bled and died on their orders. "There's a name for that," Marcus said quietly. "The futility of war. Every conflict has it. Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, Korea. Politicians make decisions, and soldiers pay the price." Harold nodded slowly. "You get it, not many people do. They see the parades and the flags, and they think war is glory. But there's no glory in watching a 19-year-old kid bleed out because a medic couldn't reach him in time. There's no glory in writing letters to mothers, telling them their sons died heroes, when the truth is they died scared and confused, just like the rest of us." A heavy silence filled the room. Marcus thought about his own experiences, the operations that had gone wrong, the men he had lost. The memories were different from Harold's, separated by decades and continents, but the emotional weight was the same. The guilt, the grief, the constant wondering if things could have gone differently. "Harold," Marcus said after a moment, "would you be willing to share this with more people? Not just me, but others. Your grandchildren, maybe. Or a wider audience." Harold's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Marcus had been thinking about this for weeks, ever since his first visit. The idea had started as a vague notion and had gradually crystallized into something concrete. "There's an organization I've been in contact with," Marcus explained. "It's called the Veterans History Project, run by the Library of Congress. They collect and preserve the personal accounts of American war veterans, audio recordings, videos, letters, photographs. They make them available to the public, to researchers, to anyone who wants to understand what veterans went through." Harold considered this. "You want me to talk to them? Tell them what I told you?" "I'd like to help you do that, yes. But only if you're comfortable with it. Your story matters, Harold. It deserves to be preserved, to be heard by future generations. The things you've experienced, the lessons you've learned, they shouldn't be forgotten." The old man was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photograph on the mantel of himself and Eleanor on their wedding day. When he spoke, his voice was softer than usual. "Eleanor used to tell me I should write a book," he said. "All those stories I'd tell her late at night when I couldn't sleep and the memories wouldn't leave me alone. She said people needed to know what we went through. I always said nobody would care. People do care, Harold. I care. And there are others who will care too, if they're given the chance to hear your story." Harold turned his gaze back to Marcus, and there was something new in his eyes. A spark that hadn't been there before. Hope, perhaps, or purpose. You really think my story is worth telling? I know it is. Harold took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling with the effort. 75 years of silence, of keeping his experiences locked inside, of assuming that no one would understand or care. And now this young man, this former SEAL, was telling him that his life mattered, that his memories deserved to be preserved. "All right," Harold said finally. "If you think it's worth it, I'll do it. But you'll have to help me. My mind isn't as sharp as it used to be, and there's a lot I've probably forgotten." Marcus smiled, a genuine expression of warmth and relief. "That's what I'm here for, Harold. We'll do this together." The decision marked a turning point, not just for Harold, but for Marcus as well. What had started as a simple act of standing up for a stranger had become something far more meaningful. A mission in the truest sense of the word, a purpose that extended beyond himself. Over the next several weeks, Marcus threw himself into the project with the same intensity he had brought to his military career. He reached out to the Veterans History Project and learned about their requirements for submissions. He researched oral history techniques, learning how to ask questions that would elicit detailed, meaningful responses. He coordinated with Harold's daughter Margaret to gather family photographs and documents that could supplement the recordings. Margaret, initially skeptical of Marcus's intentions, had gradually warmed to him. She saw the change in her father, the renewed energy and sense of purpose that had emerged since Marcus entered his life. The man who had spent years withdrawing from the world, waiting to die, was now engaged and animated in a way she hadn't seen since before her mother's passing. "I don't know how to thank you," Margaret told Marcus one evening as he was leaving Harold's house after a particularly long session. "He's like a different person. He talks about you constantly, about the project, about career. I haven't seen him this alive in years." Marcus shook his head. "Don't thank me. Your father is the one doing all the work. I'm just listening." "That's exactly what he needed," Margaret said. "Someone to listen, someone who understands." As Marcus drove home that night, he reflected on Margaret's words. Someone to listen. It seemed like such a simple thing, yet it was increasingly rare in a world of constant distraction and diminishing attention spans. People didn't take time to listen anymore, especially not to the elderly, whose stories were dismissed as ramblings from a bygone era. But those stories mattered. They were living history, windows into experiences that textbooks could never fully capture. And they were disappearing, one elderly veteran at a time, lost forever because no one had thought to ask, to listen, to preserve. Marcus resolved to do more than just help Harold. He would find other veterans, other stories, other memories at risk of being forgotten. The project he had started with one old man would expand, would become something bigger than himself. A way of honoring all those who had served, of ensuring that their sacrifices would never be forgotten. It was a new mission, and Marcus was ready to accept it. The spring had given way to early summer, and the Texas heat was beginning to assert itself with a vengeance. The day of Harold Mitchell's interview with the Veterans History Project had arrived, and Marcus was making final preparations in Harold's living room. A video camera had been set up on a tripod, borrowed from a local community college that supported the project. The lighting had been adjusted, the microphones tested, and Harold had been gently coached on what to expect. He sat in his recliner, wearing a pressed white shirt and his career veteran cap, looking both nervous and determined. "Remember," Marcus said, kneeling beside the recliner, "just tell your story the way you've been telling it to me. Don't worry about the camera. Pretend it's not there." Harold nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I haven't been this nervous since my wedding day," Marcus smiled. "You survived Korea. You can survive this." The interviewer, a woman named Dr. Patricia Wells from the University of Texas at San Antonio, arrived precisely at the scheduled time. She was in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and the calm, patient demeanor of someone who had conducted hundreds of such interviews. She greeted Harold warmly, explaining the process and making him feel at ease. Marcus stepped back, taking a position behind the camera where he could observe without interfering. This was Harold's moment, his chance to share his story with the world, and Marcus didn't want to distract from it. Dr. Wells began with simple questions, establishing Harold's background, his childhood in Oklahoma, his decision to enlist. Harold's voice was initially hesitant, but as the interview progressed, he found his rhythm. The stories flowed, vivid and detailed, painting pictures of a young man thrust into the crucible of war. He talked about the training at Fort Benning, the endless drills and the sergeants who seemed determined to break them. He talked about the ship that carried them across the Pacific, the seasickness that plagued him for the entire journey. He talked about stepping onto Korean soil for the first time, the strangeness of the landscape, the smell of smoke, and something else he couldn't identify, something that he later learned was the smell of death. Dr. Wells guided him gently through the difficult memories. The first time he saw combat, the first time he killed an enemy soldier, the first time he lost a friend. Harold's voice cracked at moments, his eyes glistening, but he pressed on, determined to give a complete account. "There was a boy," Harold said, his voice dropping to near whisper. "A Korean boy, couldn't have been more than 10 years old. His village had been destroyed by an airstrike, and he was wandering through the ruins looking for his family. We found him, gave him food and water, tried to help him. But there was nothing we could do. His family was gone, all of them." He paused, the memory clearly painful. "I think about that boy sometimes. What happened to him after we moved on? Did he survive? Did he find a new family? Or did the war take him too, like it took so many others?" Dr. Wells let the silence hang, respecting the weight of the moment. Finally, she asked, "What do you want people to understand about the Korean War, Mr. Mitchell?" Harold considered the question carefully before responding. "I want them to understand that we were just boys. Young men who didn't fully understand what we were getting into. We weren't heroes seeking glory. We were scared, cold, hungry, and far from home. We fought because we had to, because our country asked us to, because the men beside us were counting on us. And we lost friends, brothers, pieces of ourselves that we never got back. We came home changed, and the world moved on like nothing had happened. That's what I want people to understand. We served. We suffered. We deserve to be remembered." The interview continued for another 2 hours, covering Harold's return home, his adjustment to civilian life, his marriage to Eleanor, his career, and his thoughts on the current state of veterans' affairs. By the time it was finished, Harold was exhausted, but visibly moved. "Thank you," Dr. Wells said, shaking his hand. "Your story is remarkable, Mr. Mitchell. It will be preserved in the Library of Congress for future generations to access." Harold nodded, too emotional to speak. Marcus stepped forward and placed a hand on the old man's shoulder. "You did great, Harold, really great." Harold looked up at him, his eyes wet but shining. "I couldn't have done it without you, son. You gave me the courage to share." After Dr. Wells had packed up her equipment and departed, Marcus and Harold sat together in the quiet living room. The weight of the afternoon hung between them, not heavy, but significant. Something important had been accomplished. "You know," Harold said finally, "Eleanor would have been proud. She always said I needed to tell my story. I just never thought anyone would want to hear it." "A lot of people will want to hear it now," Marcus said. "And not just strangers. Your grandchildren, their children, generations of your family will be able to know what you went through, what you sacrificed." Harold smiled, a rare expression that softened his weathered features. That's the thing about getting old, Marcus. You start to think about legacy. What will people remember about you when you're gone? For most of my life, I thought no one would remember anything. But now, thanks to you, they'll have something. They'll know I mattered. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. You've always mattered, Harold. The world just needed to be reminded. They sat in companionable silence as the evening shadows lengthened across the living room floor. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood drifted through the windows. Children playing, dogs barking, the distant hum of traffic. The ordinary sounds of life continuing, oblivious to the extraordinary story that had been told within these walls. For Marcus, the day marked the culmination of weeks of effort, but also the beginning of something larger. Harold's story was just one of thousands waiting to be told. One voice in a chorus of veterans whose experiences deserved to be heard. The mission was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. 2 months had passed since Harold's interview with the Veterans History Project, and the ripple effects of that day were spreading in ways neither he nor Marcus had anticipated. The interview had been uploaded to the Library of Congress archives, where it was discovered by a documentary filmmaker named Jennifer Reyes. Jennifer had been working on a project about Korean War veterans for 3 years, traveling across the country to collect their stories before they were lost to time. When she watched Harold's interview, something clicked. His eloquence, his emotional honesty, his ability to articulate the feelings that so many veterans struggled to express. Harold Mitchell was exactly what her documentary needed. She reached out to Marcus, who had been listed as Harold's contact, and explained her project. After a lengthy conversation and a phone call with Harold, arrangements were made for Jennifer to come to San Antonio and conduct additional interviews. The documentary, titled The Forgotten Warriors, would premiere at a film festival in Austin 6 months later, to critical acclaim and audience tears. Harold's segments would become the emotional heart of the film, his words resonating with viewers who had never thought much about the Korean War before. But all of that was still in the future. On this particular morning, Marcus was dealing with a more immediate concern. He'd received a phone call from the VA medical center the previous evening. The caller identified herself as Eleanor Washington, the nurse he had spoken to the day of the incident with Patricia Chambers. She had interesting news. Patricia wanted to meet with Harold and apologize in person. Marcus's initial reaction was skepticism bordering on suspicion. Patricia had been suspended after the incident and, according to hospital gossip, had faced a formal reprimand that would be placed in her permanent file. Her career was damaged, perhaps permanently. Why would she want to apologize now? Was this genuine remorse or an attempt to rehabilitate her reputation? He discussed it with Harold, who surprised him with his response. "Let her come," Harold said. "I've been thinking about her a lot since that day. The anger, the bitterness, it doesn't do me any good. If she wants to apologize, I want to hear it. And maybe, just maybe, I can help her understand something that no reprimand ever could." So it was arranged. Patricia Chambers would come to Harold's house on Saturday afternoon, accompanied by Eleanor Washington as a witness and mediator. Marcus arrived early, wanting to be there before Patricia showed up. He found Harold in unusually high spirits, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and his career veteran cap, as if preparing for an important occasion. "You sure about this, Harold?" Marcus asked. "I'm sure," Harold replied. "In Korea, I learned that holding grudges is a poison that kills from the inside. I've carried enough poison in my life. It's time to let this one go." Patricia arrived at 2 o'clock, escorted by Eleanor. The young nurse looked markedly different from the last time Marcus had seen her. The arrogance that had characterized her demeanor at the hospital was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine apprehension. Her eyes were red-rimmed, as if she had been crying, and she clutched a small bouquet of flowers in trembling hands. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "thank you for agreeing to see me." Harold gestured for her to sit on the sofa. "Come in, child. Let's talk." Marcus and Eleanor positioned themselves across the room, close enough to hear, but far enough to give the conversation space. This was between Harold and Patricia now. Patricia sat down, placing the flowers on the coffee table. For a long moment she didn't speak, seemingly struggling to find the right words. Finally, she looked up at Harold, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she said. "What I did to you, what I said, it was unforgivable. I've been trying to understand why I acted that way, and I still don't have a good answer. I was tired, I was stressed, I was overwhelmed. But none of that justifies what I did. You deserved so much better, and I failed you." Harold listened without interrupting, his expression neutral but not unkind. When Patricia finished speaking, he leaned forward in his recliner. "Tell me something, Patricia. Why did you become a nurse?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. I wanted to help people. My grandmother was a nurse during World War II. She used to tell me stories about the soldiers she cared for, how she held their hands when they were scared, how she comforted them in their last moments. I wanted to be like her. And have you been like her? Patricia lowered her gaze, shame washing over her features. No, I've become everything she would have despised. I got so caught up in the stress, the demands, the bureaucracy, that I forgot why I started this in the first place. I stopped seeing patients as people and started seeing them as problems to be managed. That day, when I looked at you, I didn't see a veteran who had served his country. I just saw another task I didn't have time for. Harold nodded slowly, absorbing her words. You know, Patricia, in Korea, there was a medic in our unit named Thomas. Tiny little guy, couldn't have weighed more than 140 pounds, but when someone was wounded, Thomas would run through gunfire, through explosions, through hell itself to reach them. He saved more lives than any of us could count. And do you know what he used to say? He used to say that every soldier was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's husband, that when he looked at a wounded man, he saw the family waiting for him to come home. Patricia listened, tears still flowing. You forgot that, didn't you? Harold continued gently. You forgot that every patient is someone's family. I'm someone's father, someone's grandfather. When you dismissed me, you dismissed them too. I know, Patricia whispered. I know that now. Harold reached out and took her hand, a gesture that surprised everyone in the room, including Patricia herself. I forgive you, he said. Not because what you did was okay, but because carrying anger is too heavy a burden at my age. And because I believe people can change. You made a mistake, a bad one, but mistakes don't have to define us unless we let them. Patricia broke down completely, sobbing as Harold held her hand. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Probably not, Harold agreed, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. But I'm giving it to you anyway. That's kind of how forgiveness works. Marcus watched the exchange, moved in ways he hadn't expected. He had come prepared to protect Harold, to make sure Patricia didn't upset him further. Instead, he was witnessing something far more profound, an act of grace from a man who had every right to be bitter, choosing instead to show compassion. When Patricia finally composed herself, she looked at Harold with new eyes. Is there anything I can do to make this up to you, to show you I've changed? Harold considered the question. There is one thing. Go back to being the nurse your grandmother would have been proud of. See your patients as people, not problems. Remember that every one of them has a story, has a life, has people who love them. That's how you make it up to me. Patricia nodded, determination replacing the despair in her eyes. I will. I promise. After Patricia and Eleanor left, Marcus sat with Harold in the quiet living room. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting warm, golden light across the worn carpet. "That was unexpected," Marcus said. "I thought you'd want to give her a piece of your mind." Harold chuckled. "I've given enough pieces of my mind over the years. At my age, you realize that kindness takes just as much courage as anger, maybe more. That girl made a mistake, a bad one, but she's young. She has time to change, to grow, to become better. Who am I to stand in the way of that?" Marcus shook his head in admiration. "You're a better man than most, Harold." "I've had a lot of practice," Harold replied, 87 years of it. They sat together as the day wound down, two veterans from different eras, connected by bonds of service and mutual respect. The incident at the hospital, which had started as a moment of cruelty and humiliation, had transformed into something unexpected. A story of redemption, forgiveness, and the enduring capacity of the human spirit to rise above its worst impulses. And for Marcus, watching Harold extend grace to someone who had wronged him, it was a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. A reminder that strength wasn't just about physical power or tactical expertise. It was about the choices you made, the way you treated others, the legacy you left behind. Harold Mitchell, Korean War veteran, had taught him that, and Marcus would never forget it. The Texas autumn had arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and the kind of crisp, clear days that reminded Marcus of his years stationed at various bases around the country. 3 months had passed since Patricia's visit to Harold's house, and the world had continued to turn in ways both expected and surprising. The documentary The Forgotten Warriors had premiered at the Austin Film Festival to standing ovations and widespread critical acclaim. Harold had attended the premiere, accompanied by Marcus, Margaret, and a small contingent of his grandchildren. He had sat in the darkened theatre, watching himself on the big screen, listening to his own voice tell stories he had kept buried for 75 years. When the credits rolled and the audience rose to their feet in applause, Harold had tears streaming down his face. "Eleanor would have loved this," he whispered to Marcus. "She always said my story deserved to be heard." The documentary had sparked a wave of interest in Korean War veterans. News outlets reached out for interviews, veterans organizations invited Harold to speak at their events, and schools requested his participation in history lessons. At 87 years old, Harold Mitchell had become, almost overnight, a minor celebrity in the veterans community. But the attention didn't change him. He remained the same humble, soft-spoken man Marcus had met in the VA hospital waiting room. He deflected praise to his fellow veterans, always reminding audiences that he was just one voice among many, one story in a tapestry of sacrifice that spanned generations. Marcus, meanwhile, had channeled his energy into expanding the work he had started with Harold. He formed a small, non-profit organization called Stories of Service, dedicated to recording and preserving the oral histories of veterans from all conflicts. He recruited volunteers, secured funding from veterans' foundations, and began reaching out to VA hospitals and retirement communities across Texas. The work was demanding, but fulfilling in a way that his post-military life hadn't been before. Marcus had struggled with the transition from active duty to civilian life, as many veterans did. The sense of purpose, of belonging, of being part of something larger than himself, those things were hard to replace outside the military. But now, with Stories of Service, he had found a new mission, a way to continue serving even without a uniform. On this particular October morning, Marcus was sitting in Harold's living room, going over plans for the organization's first major event, a Veterans Day ceremony at the San Antonio River Walk, where Harold and several other World War II and Korean War veterans would be honored. "We're expecting about 500 people," Marcus said, reviewing the event details on his laptop. The mayor's office confirmed they're sending a representative, and there'll be coverage from 3 local TV stations. Harold shook his head in wonder. 500 people coming to hear old men talk about wars that ended before most of them were born. I never would have believed it. People are hungry for these stories, Marcus replied. They want to connect with something real, something meaningful. In a world full of noise and distraction, the authenticity of what you and the other veterans experienced cuts through all of it. There was a knock at the door, interrupting their conversation. Marcus stood to answer it and found Patricia Chambers standing on the doorstep. She was dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a sweater, and carried a small gift bag. "Hi, Marcus," she said slightly nervously. "Is this a bad time?" Marcus stepped aside to let her in. In the months since their last meeting, Patricia had kept in touch with Harold, first through occasional phone calls and then through regular visits. She had returned to her job at the VA hospital, but with a transformed attitude that her colleagues had noticed immediately. The impatient, dismissive nurse was gone, replaced by someone who took time with her patients, who listened to their concerns, who treated them with the dignity they deserved. "Patricia!" Harold called from his recliner. Come in, come in. We were just planning the Veterans Day event." Patricia entered the living room and handed Harold the gift bag. "I brought you something. I saw it and thought of you." Harold opened the bag and pulled out a small framed photograph. It showed a young soldier in a Korean War-era uniform standing in front of the American flag. The resemblance to a young Harold Mitchell was striking, but there was something different about the image. "It's my grandfather," Patricia explained. "James Chambers. He served in Korea too, from 1951 to 1953. I found this photo when I was going through my grandmother's things after she passed. She never talked about him much, and I never thought to ask. But after meeting you, I started researching his service record. He was a medic, just like Thomas in your stories." Harold studied the photograph, his expression softening. "Your grandfather was a medic in Korea?" Patricia nodded. "I didn't even know until recently. He died when I was 3, so I have no memory of him. But I found his letters, the ones he wrote to my grandmother from overseas. They're beautiful, heartbreaking. He wrote about the soldiers he couldn't save, the guilt he carried, the nightmares he had. Reading them, it changed something in me." She sat down on the sofa, her eyes meeting Harold's. "I've been thinking a lot about why I became the person who treated you so badly that day. And I realized it was because I had disconnected myself from what service really means. I went into nursing for the wrong reasons, the money, the job security, the prestige. I forgot that it's supposed to be about caring for people, especially those who have sacrificed for others." Harold reached out and patted her hand. "Your grandfather would be proud of who you're becoming now." "I hope so," Patricia said. "I'm going to find out more about him. Talk to Marcus about maybe including his story in your organization's archives. I want people to know about him, like they know about you." Marcus nodded approvingly. "We'd be honored to help preserve his story, Patricia. That's exactly what Stories of Service is for." The 3 of them sat together in Harold's living room, connected by threads they never could have anticipated. A Korean War veteran, a Navy SEAL, and a nurse whose journey from cruelty to compassion had brought her full circle to the legacy of her own grandfather. "You know," Harold said, looking at the photograph of James Chambers, "maybe this was all supposed to happen. That day at the hospital, the things you said to me, the way Marcus stepped in. Maybe it was all part of a bigger plan, to bring us together, to help us all find something we were missing." Marcus considered this. He wasn't a particularly religious man, but he had seen enough in his life to believe that things sometimes happened for reasons beyond understanding. The chain of events that had led from a hospital waiting room to this moment, this connection, this sense of purpose, it did feel like something more than coincidence. "Maybe you're right, Harold," Marcus said. "Maybe some stories are just meant to be told." Veterans Day arrived with a brilliant Texas sunrise, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too perfect to be real. The River Walk was already buzzing with activity when Marcus arrived at 6 in the morning to oversee the final preparations. The stage had been set up near the historic Alamo, a fitting location for an event honoring military service. Red, white, and blue bunting draped the scaffolding, and a large banner proclaimed, "Honoring our veterans, stories of service," in bold letters. Rows of white folding chairs stretched across the plaza, already beginning to fill with early arrivals. Marcus had been up most of the night, reviewing schedules and contingency plans with the precision of a military operation. Every detail mattered. The placement of microphones, the timing of speeches, the coordination with local TV crews. This was the inaugural event for his organization, and he wanted it to be perfect. Harold arrived at 8, accompanied by Margaret and his 2 grandchildren. He was dressed in a navy blue suit that Margaret had taken him to buy specifically for the occasion, and his Korea veteran cap sat proudly on his head. Despite his age, there was a vitality about him that hadn't been there a year ago, a spark of purpose that had been rekindled by the attention and recognition he had received. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked, helping Harold to the designated seating area for the honored veterans. "Nervous," Harold admitted. "I've spoken in front of people before, but never this many. What if I forget what I'm supposed to say?" Marcus smiled. "Then just speak from your heart. That's what people want to hear." By 10 o'clock, the plaza was packed. Marcus's estimate of 500 had proven conservative. Closer to 800 people filled the seats and lined the walkways, drawn by media coverage and word of mouth. Among them were veterans from every era, from World War II to the recent conflicts in the Middle East, along with their families, supporters, and curious civilians who wanted to be part of something meaningful. The ceremony began with a color guard presentation by local ROTC cadets, followed by the national anthem, sung by a Marine Corps veteran who had become a professional opera singer after his discharge. Then came the speeches. The mayor's representative offered warm words of gratitude. A congressman delivered remarks about the importance of remembering those who served, and a representative from the Veterans History Project spoke about the ongoing effort to preserve veterans' stories. Finally, it was Harold's turn. Marcus helped him to the podium, staying close in case he needed assistance. Harold gripped the edges of the lectern, looking out at the sea of faces before him. For a moment he seemed overwhelmed, his eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for familiar landmarks in unfamiliar territory. Then he began to speak. "My name is Harold Mitchell," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves. "I'm 87 years old, and I served in the United States Army during the Korean War. I want to thank all of you for being here today, for taking time out of your lives to honor those of us who served." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "A year ago, I was just an old man in a wheelchair, waiting in a hospital for a doctor's appointment. I didn't think my story mattered. I didn't think anyone cared about what happened in Korea 75 years ago. But then something happened that changed my perspective." He glanced at Marcus, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "A young man, a former Navy SEAL named Marcus Thompson, stood up for me when I couldn't stand up for myself. He reminded me that my service mattered, that my story deserved to be told, and because of him, I'm standing here today talking to all of you." The crowd was silent, captivated by the old man's words. "I've learned something in this past year," Harold continued, "something I wish I had learned a long time ago. Our stories, the things we've experienced, The sacrifices we've made, they don't just belong to us, they belong to everyone. They're part of the fabric of this nation, threads woven into a tapestry that tells the story of who we are as a people. When we share our stories, we strengthen that tapestry. When we stay silent, we let it unravel. He looked out at the crowd, at the young veterans and the old, at the families and the supporters, at the faces of a nation that too often took its freedoms for granted. I want to ask something of all of you today. Don't let our stories be forgotten. Talk to the veterans in your families, in your communities. Listen to what they have to say. Record their memories. Preserve their experiences. Because when we're gone, and we won't be here much longer, our stories will be all that's left. They'll be our legacy. His voice caught slightly, emotion breaking through the practiced calm. I think about the men I served with in Korea, the ones who didn't come home. They were boys, most of them, younger than many of you sitting here today. They gave everything they had so that future generations could live in freedom. The least we can do is remember them. The least we can do is tell their stories so that the world knows they existed, they mattered, they made a difference. He straightened, his weathered face set with determination. That's what I want my legacy to be, not medals or awards, not recognition or fame. I want to be remembered as someone who helped keep the stories alive, someone who made sure that the sacrifices of my brothers in arms weren't forgotten. Harold stepped back from the podium, and for a moment there was silence. Then someone in the crowd began to clap. Another joined, then another, until the entire plaza erupted in applause that seemed to roll across the river walk like thunder. Marcus helped Harold back to his seat. Both of them moved beyond words. The ceremony continued with additional speakers and presentations, but Harold's speech remained the centerpiece, the moment that people would remember and talk about long after the event was over. When the ceremony concluded, Harold was surrounded by well-wishers, veterans who wanted to shake his hand, families who wanted to thank him, journalists who wanted quotes for their stories. Marcus stood nearby, watching with a pride that felt almost paternal. Patricia Chambers emerged from the crowd, her eyes red from crying. She embraced Harold without words, holding him for a long moment before stepping back. "That was beautiful," she said. "My grandfather would have been so proud." Harold smiled at her. "He is proud, I'm sure of it." As the crowd began to disperse and the afternoon sun climbed higher in the Texas sky, Marcus found himself standing alone by the stage, looking out at the scene before him. The folding chairs were emptying, the bunting was being taken down, the normal rhythm of the river walk was reasserting itself. But something had changed, something that couldn't be measured or quantified. Stories had been shared. Connections had been made. A legacy had been honored, and Marcus Thompson, former Navy SEAL, had found a new mission that would guide the rest of his life. 6 months had passed since the Veterans Day ceremony, and the impact of that day continued to ripple outward in ways both large and small. Stories of service had grown beyond Marcus's wildest expectations. What had started as a one-man operation working out of his home workshop had expanded into a legitimate non-profit with a small staff, a dedicated office space in downtown San Antonio, and partnerships with veterans organizations across the state. They had recorded over 200 oral histories, documenting the experiences of veterans from World War II through the recent conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. The documentary The Forgotten Warriors, featuring Harold Mitchell prominently, had won awards at several film festivals and been picked up for distribution by a major streaming service. Harold had become something of a celebrity in the veterans community, receiving invitations to speak at events across the country. He couldn't accept most of them. Traveling at his age was too difficult, but he made time for local appearances and phone calls with schools and organizations that wanted to hear his story. But time, as it always does, continued its inexorable march. Marcus received the call on a Tuesday morning in late April. It was Margaret, her voice breaking as she delivered the news he had been dreading since the day he first met her father. "It's Dad," she said. "He had a stroke last night. They say it's not good." Marcus was at the hospital within the hour, navigating the same corridors where he had first encountered Harold over a year ago. The cardiology wing had been replaced by the intensive care unit, but the antiseptic smell and fluorescent lights were the same. The sense of lives hanging in the balance, of hope and fear intertwined, was unchanged. He found Margaret in the waiting room, her face streaked with tears, her hands clutching a rosary that had belonged to her mother. She stood when she saw Marcus and fell into his embrace without a word. "How is he?" Marcus asked when she finally pulled back. "The doctors say the stroke was massive. There's significant brain damage. He's on life support, but—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Marcus nodded, the weight of the news settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He had known this day would come. Harold was 88 years old after all, but knowing and accepting were two very different things. "Can I see him?" Margaret led him to Harold's room, where the old man lay surrounded by machines, their rhythmic beeping the only sound in the quiet space. Harold looked smaller than Marcus remembered, shrunken somehow, as if the force of his personality had been the thing holding his body together. Marcus pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed, taking Harold's hand in his own. The skin was papery and cool, the fingers limp. But Marcus held on anyway, hoping that somewhere in the depths of unconsciousness, Harold could sense his presence. "Hey, Harold," he said softly. "It's Marcus. I'm here." There was no response, no flicker of recognition. The monitors continued their steady beeping, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath them. Marcus sat with Harold for the next several hours, talking to him about everything and nothing. He talked about the organization, about the stories they had collected, about the veterans who had come forward to share their experiences because of Harold's example. He talked about Patricia, who had called as soon as she heard the news and was on her way to the hospital. He talked about the documentary, which had just been nominated for an Emmy Award. "You did this, Harold," Marcus said. "All of it. You changed lives, including mine. I was lost when I met you, searching for a purpose I couldn't find. And you gave me that purpose. You showed me that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It just takes different forms." The day wore on, visitors coming and going. Patricia arrived with flowers, her face pale with grief. Veterans from the local community stopped by to pay their respects. The staff at the hospital, many of whom knew Harold from his regular appointments, expressed their condolences. As evening fell, the doctors gathered the family to discuss options. The prognosis was grim. Harold's brain had sustained too much damage to recover. He would never regain consciousness. The machines were the only thing keeping him alive. Margaret, her face etched with the agony of an impossible decision, asked for time to think, to consult with her siblings who were on their way from out of state. The doctors agreed to wait, to give the family space to process and decide. That night, Marcus stayed at the hospital, unable to leave Harold's side. He dozed in the chair beside the bed, waking periodically to the sounds of nurses checking vitals and adjusting equipment. In his dreams, he saw Harold as he had been at the Veterans' Day ceremony, standing at the podium, his voice strong and clear, telling the world not to forget. The next morning, Harold's children gathered in the waiting room. Margaret, her brother Thomas, who had flown in from Chicago, and her sister Elizabeth, who had driven through the night from Dallas. They sat together, holding hands, remembering their father as he had been, not the frail figure in the hospital bed, but the strong, principled man who had shaped their lives. Marcus gave them privacy, stepping outside to call Sarah and update her on the situation. When he returned, Margaret approached him with tears in her eyes. "We've made a decision," she said. "We're going to let him go. It's what he would have wanted. He always said he didn't want to be kept alive by machines, didn't want to linger without dignity." Marcus nodded, his own eyes stinging. "I understand. But we want you to be there," Margaret continued. When we say goodbye. You meant so much to him, Marcus. You gave him the best year of his life." "He gave me even more," Marcus replied. "It would be an honor." The process was gentle, almost peaceful. The family gathered around Harold's bed, holding his hands, speaking softly to him. A chaplain led a brief prayer, invoking the comfort of the divine for a soul preparing to depart. And then, one by one, the machines were disconnected. For a few minutes, Harold breathed on his own, shallow breaths that grew increasingly shallow until finally they stopped. The cardiac monitor, which had been tracking his heartbeat, showed a flat line. A nurse checked for a pulse, shook her head and noted the time of death, 3:47 p.m. on April 28th. Harold Mitchell, Master Sergeant, United States Army, Korean War veteran, beloved father and grandfather, friend and mentor, was gone. The funeral was held 3 days later at a small church in the neighborhood where Harold had lived for over 40 years. The pews were packed with mourners, family, friends, veterans from across the region, colleagues from the VA hospital, and strangers who had been touched by his story through the documentary or Marcus's organization. Marcus delivered the eulogy, standing at the pulpit in his dress blues, the only time he had worn his uniform since retiring from the Navy. He spoke of Harold's service, his sacrifice, his quiet dignity in the face of adversity. He spoke of their friendship, forged in an unlikely encounter at a VA hospital, strengthened by shared understanding and mutual respect. And he spoke of Harold's legacy, the stories he had told, the lives he had touched, the reminder he had given to a forgetful nation. Harold Mitchell once told me that he wanted to be remembered as someone who helped keep the stories alive, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Because of him, hundreds of veterans have come forward to share their experiences. Because of him, a documentary has been seen by millions, reminding them of a war that was almost forgotten. Because of him, an organization exists that will continue to preserve and share these stories for generations to come. He paused, looking out at the faces before him. But Harold's greatest legacy isn't in the stories he told. It's in the way he lived, with integrity, with dignity, with a willingness to forgive those who wronged him and embrace those who helped him. He showed us what it means to be a good person, not through grand gestures, but through the everyday choices he made. He treated everyone with respect. He found purpose even in his final years, and he taught us that it's never too late to make a difference. Marcus stepped back from the pulpit, his role complete. The service continued with hymns and prayers, readings and remembrances. At the graveside, a military honor guard performed a 3-volley salute, the shots echoing across the cemetery. A bugler played taps, the mournful notes floating on the spring breeze, and a folded American flag was presented to Margaret, who accepted it with trembling hands and tears streaming down her face. As the crowd dispersed, Marcus stood alone at the grave for a long moment, saying his final goodbye. He thought about all that had happened since that day in the hospital waiting room, the journey that had led from a chance encounter to this moment of farewell. He thought about the lessons Harold had taught him, the purpose he had helped him find, and he made a silent promise to the man lying in the ground before him. "I'll keep the stories alive, Harold, for you, for all the veterans whose voices deserve to be heard. I won't let the world forget He placed a single white rose on the casket, then turned and walked away, ready to continue the mission that Harold Mitchell had helped him discover. The summer sun beat down on the new headquarters of Stories of Service, a renovated warehouse in downtown San Antonio that had been transformed into a state-of-the-art facility for recording and preserving veterans' oral histories. Marcus stood outside the entrance, watching as workers hung a large banner above the door, the Harold Mitchell Center for Veterans Stories. It had been 3 months since Harold's death, and Marcus had channeled his grief into building something permanent, something that would honor his friend's memory for generations to come. The naming of the center had been unanimous among the board of directors, most of whom had known Harold personally or been moved by his story in the documentary. The grand opening ceremony was scheduled for the following week, timed to coincide with Memorial Day weekend. Dignitaries had been invited, media coverage had been arranged, and veterans from across the state would be gathering to celebrate and participate. But for now, Marcus simply wanted to take a moment to appreciate what had been accomplished. "It's really something, isn't it?" He turned to find Patricia Chambers standing beside him, shielding her eyes from the sun as she looked up at the building. "It's exactly what he would have wanted," Marcus replied. "A place where stories can be preserved, where veterans can be heard." Patricia nodded. "I still think about him every day. What he taught me, how he forgave me. I try to live up to that, you know. To be the kind of person he saw I could be. I think he'd be proud of who you've become, Patricia." She smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "Thanks to him, and to you." They stood together in comfortable silence, united by their shared connection to a man who had changed both their lives. Inside the building, Sarah was supervising the final preparations for the opening. The main recording studio had been equipped with professional-grade cameras and sound equipment, capable of capturing high-quality interviews that would be preserved for posterity. A museum space displayed photographs and artifacts from various conflicts donated by veterans and their families. And a library housed the growing collection of oral histories accessible to researchers, students, and anyone interested in learning from those who had served. "Marcus," Sarah called from the doorway, "the caterer has a question about the Memorial Day setup." He waved acknowledgement and started toward the building, but paused to take one last look at the banner bearing Harold's name. A year and a half ago, he had walked into a VA hospital for a routine appointment and witnessed an act of casual cruelty against a stranger. He had chosen to speak up, to stand for someone who couldn't stand for himself. And that choice had set in motion a chain of events that led him here, to this moment, to this purpose. Harold Mitchell had taught him that every person has a story worth telling, that dignity is something everyone deserves, regardless of age or circumstance, that forgiveness is a choice and compassion is a strength, and that it's never too late to find meaning, to make a difference, to leave the world better than you found it. Marcus carried those lessons with him every day. And through the Harold Mitchell Center for Veterans Stories, he would ensure that they were passed on to future generations. The stories would live on, the sacrifices would be remembered, and the legacy of a Korean War veteran who had once felt forgotten would endure forever, because some stories are too important to be lost, and some people are too special to be forgotten.